Welcome back. We're continuing to critique this book, Coming to Grips with Genesis, Biblical Authority in the Age of the Earth. And I've talked already about the issue of the days of creation, and I've talked about animal death. I want to talk this time about the argument that these authors make from history. I want to be very fair to these authors. They say explicitly that you cannot base a doctrine of Scripture upon the teaching of theologians of the past. You have to base your doctrines upon the Bible itself. They're very clear about this. I also want to say I enjoyed the chapters on history. I like historical theology. I like knowing what the church fathers believed. I like knowing what the reformers believed. I'm very interested in this, and I appreciate being given information about it. And I think the chapters are well written, and I find them persuasive. I suppose other historians might come along and quibble with details, but as far as I can tell, these are well-written chapters and very, very useful to me personally and perhaps to others. Nevertheless, I do have to say, I don't think that these chapters help us very much with our quest to determine the correct way of dealing with the challenge of modern science to the traditional reading of Genesis, for the simple reason that these authors didn't have to face it. Prior to the mid-18th century, there was no reason for anybody to doubt that the earth is young. There was no reason to doubt that the Bible teaches that. And you recall we had a similar instance, we talked about it in an earlier message, in which the church for about 17 centuries was convinced that the Bible teaches that the earth is established, it does not move. They took it literally, and it was not until the time of Galileo and the evidence he was able to gather from his telescope, and then the work of Johannes Kepler and eventually Isaac Newton, it was not until then that the church realized it had been misreading the scriptures. So previous writers prior to that time had all believed that the earth does not move. They were wrong, but you can't say that they would have remained wrong had they lived in the time of Galileo. We don't know. And in the same way, you can point to the reformers and the church fathers and everybody else and say, look, they all believe that the earth is young and that the days of creation were literal days. And that's an interesting historical fact, but it simply does not tell us what they would have done had they been living in our current situation. They faced doctrinal issues for their day. They faced challenges for their time. This issue is for our time. Ever since the second half of the 18th century, we have been facing a situation in which there is gathering evidence and massive evidence from geology and earth sciences and from astronomy and from physics that the earth and universe are very, very old. And we're the ones who have to decide what we're going to do about it. We really can't lean too heavily upon Luther and Calvin, or my favorite, Jonathan Edwards, who was writing in the first half of the 18th century and believed that the earth is a few thousand years old and that the days of creation were literal days. We can't lean too heavily on these people, however much we may love them and appreciate them, simply because they didn't face the situation we face. We've got to do it for ourselves. Is there anything we can learn from them? Well, I think it's not wise to say that we're sure that if they lived, they would have taken our side or the other side. It's tempting to do that, to say, well, if Calvin were alive today, he'd be a young earth creationist, or if he were alive today, he'd be an old earth creationist. It's tempting, but we have no basis for making that statement. I think we can say one thing about at least some of the best representatives of the theological tradition, and that is, I think that many of them would at least tell us that in this current situation, we must take time to understand the science. There's a very interesting passage in Augustine's book, The Literal Meaning of Genesis, in which he makes a comment that I think is pertinent to us today. Let me read this passage to you. Augustine says this. This is in Book 1, Chapter 18. He says, in matters that are obscure and far beyond our vision, even such as we may find treated in Holy Scripture, different interpretations are sometimes possible without prejudice to the faith we have received. In such a case, we should not rush in headlong and so firmly take our stand on one side that, if further progress in the search for truth justly undermines this position, we too fall with it. That would be to battle not for the teaching of Holy Scripture, but for our own, wishing its teaching to conform to ours, whereas we ought to wish ours to conform to that of Holy Scripture. It's a long sentence, or a couple of sentences. What he's saying is, in disputed areas, we better be careful. We'd better not wed ourselves too quickly to one interpretation of Scripture, because further investigation may produce information that will lead to our changing our position. I think that Augustine would say, under our modern circumstances, that it's necessary to understand what geology and astronomy are teaching. I think that Augustine, before writing on the topic of Genesis, would make sure that he had thoroughly digested that information. I can't prove that, but I think it's true. Let me also give you something from Calvin. I find this extraordinarily interesting. Calvin, in his commentary on the Psalms, makes a comment on Psalm 104, verse 5. In the ESV, Psalm 104, verse 5 reads as following: He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. Now, what's Calvin's comment? Let me read Calvin's comment. Calvin says, He hath founded the earth upon its foundations. Here the prophet celebrates the glory of God as manifested in the stability of the earth. Since it is suspended in the midst of the air and is supported only by pillars of water, how does it keep its place so steadfastly that it cannot be moved? This I indeed grant may be explained on natural principles. For the earth, as it occupies the lowest place, being the center of the world, naturally settles down there. Well, you read this and you say, John, what are you saying? Mr. Calvin, what are you saying here? He says that the earth is suspended in air. He says that it is supported by pillars of water. He says that it is at the center of the universe and at the lowest place. What on earth is he doing in this passage? I think what he's doing is this. I think Calvin is bringing his best exegetical skill to bear on the passage, and also bringing the best science of his day to bear on the passage. From science, he's taking a couple of things. First of all, he knows that the earth is a ball suspended, as he says, in air. We would say in space. Many of the early fathers didn't believe that. They believed that the earth is a disk. But by the time of Calvin, of course, the earth has been circumnavigated, and everybody understands that it's a ball. And so Calvin believes that the earth is suspended in space. He's taken that from science, not from scientific experimentation, but from observation of the world itself. The other thing he takes from science is Aristotle's bad science, Aristotle's incorrect idea that the earth is at the center of all things and is sort of by nature the lowest of all things. No, we know that that's not true. We know that Aristotle was wrong. But Aristotle's science was the best science Calvin had available to him. Now, why in the world does Calvin say that the earth is put on pillars of water? Well, he says pillars because the text, is it this text or others, speaks of the earth being placed on pillars. And why water? Well, my guess is it's because Psalm 24 verse 2 says that God has founded the earth upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. I'm not sure, but I would guess that may be where Calvin is drawing the idea of water. So the earth is suspended on pillars, and the earth is founded upon waters. So he decides that the earth is placed upon pillars of water. And so you get this kind of strange conglomeration of ideas. It is a sphere, it is a ball that is suspended in air. It is at the lowest place and at the center of the universe, and it is founded upon pillars of water. Well, when you read this, what do you want to do? You want to just laugh at John Calvin for his misunderstandings? I don't think we should laugh at him. I think we should understand what Calvin is doing. Calvin believes in taking the best of science as well as the best of his scriptural exegesis and trying to find ways to put them together. And I think Calvin, if he were alive today, would be the first to want to understand in depth the reasons why geologists and other earth scientists and astronomers and physicists and astrophysicists believe that the universe is old. I believe that Calvin would insist upon understanding that science. And we're going to get there, and we're getting close. there is one more thing we need to do first. I want to look next time at the attitude toward science that is demonstrated by the authors of this book. I think there are some real problems in their view of modern science. And I think we need to look at those because those attitudes have an effect on everybody who is educated within young Earth circles. Next time, we look at their view of science. Thank you for watching.